Today I will be painting a watercolor mountain stream. I'm using Arch's watercolor paper. This is cold press, and I'm starting off by kind of figuring out where I want my sky to be. I'm just using an 8 round brush, and I'm just getting the top part of my paper wet with some clean water, and I'm kind of mapping out my sky. I'm just working on a small scale today. This is a 5x7 piece of paper, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of dab some color into my sky with this light blue. It's kind of a cerulean blue color, and then I have a little bit of, I think it's a phthalo blue mixed with it as well. So you can just kind of see I'm trying not to brush, but instead kind of dab into my wet sky so that I don't have a perfectly blended look. It looks more like maybe some scattered clouds filling up the sky. So I'm just really trying to kind of dab with my brush and add some interest to the sky area with my blue. And as long as the sky is wet, the color will kind of bleed around into that area. So you can kind of see it's just kind of spreading out into that area. I'm taking a Kleenex now, and I'm even going to lift some areas out by just kind of dabbing to get kind of a cloud like feel. So I want it just to be kind of like a puffy, cloud-filled sky. I'm also going to add a little bit more dark blue up in the corner just to kind of keep the viewer's eye inside of the painting. I'm kind of making sure to sculpt around the top parts of my mountains. Now the next thing I want to add in is a stream. So I'm going to go ahead and use my darker blue paint. This is an ultramarine blue. And I'm just going to start with a little straight line, and then I'm working around some rock type shapes to fill in the other parts of the stream. You can see I'm kind of going in a diagonal line down towards the bottom left corner. I can kind of keep it light right away, and then I can add brown maybe as a reflection, a little bit more dark as I kind of come through here. But I'm going around these rock type shapes that will be covering up parts of my stream, maybe some bushes that will cover up parts of my stream, just to kind of fill in this area and get my stream in here while I'm working with the blues. I also am kind of jumping down to my stream because I didn't want my mountains to blend in with my sky. So while I'm waiting for my sky to dry, I would go ahead and work on another area of the painting that's not touching the sky so that my colors don't bleed together. Now I'm going to leave a little bit of space in my stream for like the splash, the foam of the water, because there are some rocks in here. The water is going to splash down, creating some foam. So I'm leaving part of it white to kind of give that indication that yes, there is some movement in this water. It's not just a calm stream, but you know, it is going over some rocks and things. I'm also using my Kleenex here to kind of soften some of these edges and give it kind of that texture, or that soft texture of what like a foam or a splash would look like. You can always add more like dark later. For now, I'm keeping it kind of light and just kind of indicating that splash or that movement through the water. The last thing I want to do on this painting for this first layer is I want to mix together kind of a nice rocky color. I want it to be nice and warm, so I used some yellow ochre, a little bit of purple, and some brown. And I'm putting my brush almost flat against the picture so I get this nice rough texture. Using cold press watercolor paper, it has kind of a rough texture already. And so just by kind of scraping the side of my brush over that texture, it will pick up some paint only in certain areas and will leave other areas of the paper white. So I decided to kind of scrub up my paper a little bit to get an idea of a rough texture for some of these rocks. And I'm just going to put this down first, and then later on we'll add a little bit more detail there. All right, I've let my picture dry, and now I'm going to go ahead and start putting in the mountains. Now these mountains are a really nice solid diagonal shape for this painting. So they're very tall on the left, and then they go down at a diagonal towards the right. So at this point, I'm just kind of filling in, just like I did with the rocks on the bottom. I can leave some texture up in the mountains too, just by turning my brush sideways as I pull it down. And then I'm kind of trying to focus on getting a nice color. So you can see I've got some blue mixed with brown on my palette here. My favorite combination is burnt umber and ultramarine blue, but I've used other options as well. And the reason I like using blue and brown for this color is it really works well when you want to have good control over how cool or warm your grays are. So sometimes I want my gray to be a little bit more cool, and so I add a little more blue to the color. And then other times I want my grays to be a little bit more warm, so I add more brown to the color. So as I throw in some of these grays and these distant peaks, right now I'm kind of leaning more towards cool because of the atmospheric perspective, which is things that are way far away tend to be cooler and lighter, less details, things like that. So I'm thinking of that as I paint these distant peaks off in the distance. And notice that my paint or my mountain right now on the right is a little lighter. The one on the left is a little darker because it's closer. So these are things I'm thinking about. I am leaving some white areas of the mountain showing because of the snow. And I'm not too worried about where my mountains are going down on the bottom because I will have some trees that will kind of intersect them later. While I'm letting that dry, I'm going to go ahead and start adding some of the greenery in the foreground. So I have kind of a yellow green, it's like a sap green, maybe mixed with some yellow. And that is a great color to add into the foreground here. As things come closer, they tend to get warmer. So I like to have some of my closer greens a little bit more yellowy in tone. And I am adding these nice little bush-like textures here along the side of my mountain stream. I've got kind of a nice big bushy area here on the left, and you can kind of play with it while it's still wet. Maybe add a little more color, maybe add other colors, yellows, blues. You can even get wild and do pinks. You could add flowers in this area. That might be kind of a fun addition. But I'm just trying to keep it warm, light, spontaneous, and to kind of fill up this front area here with some greenery, kind of mapping out where the stream goes and kind of where the rocks start and stop as well. I'm also going to kind of define the top edge of these distant rocks here. So I'm taking my green and I'm going to bring it right above those. Again, while this is wet, I will add in some other colors, maybe even a little extra water just to give it some interest. You can really kind of play around. This is a great time to experiment with wet paint and see what happens when you add things. You could add salt at this point too. Salt and watercolor makes for some great bush-like textures as well. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as so, and I'm working on kind of throwing in a little bit more greenery in the background. Again, just trying to make it varied, add some different greens, different textures, filling that up with green. I'm going to kind of work into the top area a little bit with some of this lighter green. I will be adding some darker green in later, so it doesn't have to be perfectly filled, just kind of looking for some highlighted areas where it might look a little bit lighter. I'm working into a dry area, so I need to have enough water on my brush if I want the paint to kind of fill the area. And then I'm just trying to kind of fill in under the mountains here, this section between mountains and then the foreground. So I would say this is kind of the middle ground area that I'm trying to establish here, right behind the bushes and the stream. And again, not doing anything too fancy, just kind of filling it in with some color. All right, now I want to start defining some of my rock shapes. And I'm doing this by using a darker mixture of my blue and brown combination. Notice this time I'm warmer than those mountains in the distance. So I have more brown on my brush, less blue, and I'm trying to kind of define where these rocks start and stop by adding some shadow to the bottom edges of the rocks. So I'm going in and kind of defining that bottom edge with another layer of color here. And I want to try to start figuring out kind of some boundaries here for these different rock shapes. You can kind of make it up as you go, paint in some different shapes, crevices, cracks in the rocks. Right now it's just all kind of one big blob. So by using this, I can kind of define those shapes a little bit better. And I'm still using my same brush. This brush gets to a really nice point, so you can see I can just draw in the lines and then kind of fill the shapes as I go. I also want to work on adding a little bit more interest in the distant mountains. So now I'm going in and adding a second layer of value. Now I did speed up my painting just a little bit as to not make it drag too much, but I am adding a second layer. I want to still let some of that light first layer show through, but I also want to help define and add a little bit more dimension to the rock formations that are up there on the mountain tops. So I'm just adding a little bit more dark. I'm kind of dabbing my brush here and there to kind of fill in, trying to preserve some of the light areas that I started with, and really just trying to pay attention to the values that I'm using. I don't want to have too high of contrast way in this background because I want the excitement to really be in the foreground where the stream is, so I don't want to overdo it with the detail on my mountains. Keep it simple and move on. Now I am mixing in some greens for the kind of foresty area that's going right up against my mountain area. And I used a sap green, but then I added some blue to it as well because it's in the distance and it has that atmospheric perspective. The trees tend to have a little bit more of a blue hue being farther back in the distance. So I'm just kind of pointing my brush towards the top part of my painting and then kind of making some different lines all the way down, kind of pushing my brush up and pulling it down to give kind of a zigzaggy type line at the top parts of my trees to make it believable tree line here up into the mountains. And then it's going to kind of connect with this green hill, so I'm trying to keep that line contained as I am bringing my tree line down to connect there. And by having this more blue and a little bit darker, it kind of can help put it behind the hill in front of it that's a little bit lighter. So you can kind of play with some of that value to help create depth in the painting. While it's wet, I'm adding a shadow at the bottom part of the trees. Again, just by mixing some green and some blue. And I'm kind of taking that all the way across to the other side of my painting here with that shadow. Filling in details as I go. I'm finding a couple places to darken even more up where the trees meet the mountains, just to give a little bit more contrast to that area. And then now I want to do the same in the middle ground and foreground. So I want to just build up some of my darker colors in here. I'm working into a wet or a dry area, so I need to make sure that I've got enough on my brush to kind of keep the paint moving along this area. I like keeping that light edge against the trees just for depth, but I am darkening kind of the bottom edge of this area. I also want to have nice sharp areas down here where there's shadow under these bushes to help separate the bushes from the water. So I'm kind of making a nice strong shadow, and then I'm softening it a little bit by adding water to the area while it's still wet, and it kind of softens the edge a little bit to make it so it's not so strong. I want to darken the edge above these rocks so that they stand out a little bit more. Right now they were kind of just blending in with the background, so by adding a little bit more dark behind the rocks, it kind of brings them forward. At this point, I'm just like looking at relationships between things. So I'm looking at where the bush and the water meet and which one should be darker, which one should be lighter. How can I make it more believable? How can I make it a stronger painting? I'm looking at relationships between light and shadow. Do they need to be hard? Do they need to be soft? I'm looking at relationships between things in the foreground, things in the middle ground. What can I do to add that depth? All of these things I'm thinking about as I continue to touch up the painting. Here's the final piece. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I ended up just touching up some little things here and there and continued to kind of jump around my painting until I was happy with the outcome. Please check out my channel, Ehlke Art, for more tutorials. We'll see you again soon.